I used to love Christmas Eve. The cozy lights, the quiet anticipation, and the peacefulness of my little house buried in snow. But after what happened on Christmas Eve 2018, I dread the season. The memory of that night and what I saw haunts me still. I was spending Christmas Eve alone that year. It wasn't my choice. My family's plans had fallen apart after a sudden snowstorm made travel impossible. My parents were stuck in Denver, my sister in Chicago. So I stayed in our small family cabin tucked away in the woods outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I figured a quiet night with some hot cocoa, a book, and the Christmas tree lights glowing softly would be peaceful, maybe even magical. The snow had been falling all day, blanketing the world in silence. By 7 p.m., it was coming down so heavily that I could barely see the edge of the porch. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and settled into the armchair with my book. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the cabin creaked in protest. It was cozy, or at least it should have been. At 9:30 p.m., I got up to check the locks. I wasn't paranoid, just cautious. I lived in the city, and old habits die hard. The cabin's main door was bolted, the windows latched. Satisfied, I returned to my chair. But as I passed the front window, something made me stop. A flicker of movement in the yard caught my eye. I pressed my face to the cold glass and peered into the swirling snow. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the trees. But then I saw it, a figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the woods. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough that I knew they were staring at the cabin. My breath fogged the glass as I watched, heart pounding. Who would be out there in a storm like this? I told myself it was a neighbor, maybe someone lost or in need of help. But the nearest cabin was a mile away, and none of my neighbors had mentioned guests. A part of me wanted to open the door and call out to them, but something about the figure felt wrong. They didn't move, didn't shift against the cold. They just stood there, motionless. The wind howled louder, shaking the cabin. When I glanced back at the window, the figure was gone. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or a tree swaying in the wind. But my unease grew as the night wore on. The fire crackled softly, but the storm outside seemed to grow louder, more relentless. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Around 11 p.m., I heard it, a faint scratching sound at the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone testing the wood with their nails. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate scrape. It was unmistakable. Someone was outside. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the wind and that horrible scratching. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone out, but with the storm, it might take a while. "Just stay inside," she said. "Don't open the door for anyone." I hung up and grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen. Slowly, I approached the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The scratching stopped as I reached the entryway. I stood there, flashlight raised, staring at the wood as if I could see through it. Then the doorknob rattled. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Then a voice came, muffled but clear enough to send chills down my spine. "Let me in," it said. The tone was flat, emotionless, almost mechanical. "Who are you?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I need help. Please let me in." It didn't sound like someone who needed help. There was no desperation, no urgency. Just that same eerie monotone. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to the living room, keeping my eyes on the door. The voice continued, repeating the same phrases, over and over. "Let me in, please. I need help." Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The yard was empty, the snow pristine except for a trail of footprints leading from the door to the woods. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. Something wasn't right. I turned back toward the living room, and that's when I saw it. The figure was standing outside the glass patio door at the back of the cabin, its face pressed against the glass. Pale, expressionless, and wrong. Its eyes were too wide, its mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-sentence. It raised a hand and tapped on the glass. I don't remember much about what happened next. I know I screamed. I know I grabbed my phone and ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The sheriff's deputy arrived about 20 minutes later, but it felt like hours. By the time he got there, the figure was gone. The deputies searched the property, but found nothing unusual, just the footprints in the snow. He told me it was probably a vagrant or someone lost in the storm, but I knew better. There was nothing human about what I'd seen. I left the cabin the next morning and never went back. My family tried to convince me to return, to enjoy the memories we'd made there, but I couldn't. Even now, years later, I can't drive through the woods without feeling that same cold dread. And every Christmas Eve, I make sure I'm never alone. I don't remember much about what happened next. I know I screamed. I know I grabbed my phone and ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The sheriff's deputy arrived about 20 minutes later, but it felt like hours. By the time he got there, the figure was gone. The deputies searched the property, but found nothing unusual, just the footprints in the snow. He told me it was probably a vagrant or someone lost in the storm, but I knew better. There was nothing human about what I'd seen. I left the cabin the next morning and never went back. My family tried to convince me to return, to enjoy the memories we'd made there, but I couldn't. Even now, years later, I can't drive through the woods without feeling that same cold dread. And every Christmas Eve, I make sure I'm never alone. Christmas was always a busy time for me as the director of our church's choir. We sang hymns to bring light and joy to the season. But in December 2021, during a late-night rehearsal, we encountered something that brought only darkness. Something that still makes my skin crawl every time I hear Silent Night. It was a cold December evening, just a week before Christmas. The snow had been falling heavily all day, blanketing the small town of Rockford in white. Our choir, a group of 10 dedicated members, had gathered at St. Mary's Church for one last rehearsal before the Christmas Eve service. The church, a towering Gothic structure with high vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows, was beautiful but eerie at night. The rehearsal had gone smoothly until about 9 p.m. The last hymn on our list was Silent Night. As we sang, the sound echoed beautifully through the empty church. But halfway through the second verse, a strange note rang out, deep and dissonant, like nothing I'd ever heard before. We stopped abruptly, confused. Did someone's phone go off? I asked, though I knew it wasn't a ringtone. Everyone shook their heads. One of the sopranos, Elise, looked pale. It came from up there, she whispered, pointing to the choir loft above us. The loft had been empty for years. The old organ stored there was broken, and no one had any reason to go up. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. When I reached the top, the loft was empty, just dust-covered pews and the broken organ. But as I turned to go back down, I saw it. A shadow darting across the back of the church, moving too quickly to be natural. My pulse quickened as I descended the stairs. "There's nothing up there," I said, trying to sound calm. But I could see the doubt in their faces, and truthfully, I didn't believe it myself. Something had been up there. We tried to continue, but the mood had shifted. Every note we sang seemed to echo too loudly, the church's usual warmth replaced by a chill that seeped into my bones. Elise spoke up again. "I don't think we should sing anymore," she said. "Why?" I asked. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the darkened loft. "It feels like someone is listening." Her words hung in the air, and none of us could shake the feeling that she was right. As I stood in the choir loft, gripping the flashlight tightly, my breath fogged in the cold air. The shadow I'd seen moved too fast to be a trick of the light. My heart raced as I swept the beam across the room. The organ sat in the corner, its once grand pipes now tarnished and silent. Dust-covered pews lined the walls, undisturbed except for faint, long-dried footprints. "Is anyone up here?" I called out, my voice echoing back to me. No response. I took a cautious step forward. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, and the beam of my flashlight landed on something peculiar, a sheet of music lying on the floor. It was old, the edges yellowed and frayed. The title at the top read, Cantus Mortis. The words beneath it were written in Latin, unfamiliar and unsettling. I knelt to pick it up, the paper brittle in my hands. As I did, a low, guttural hum filled the loft. It wasn't coming from below or outside. It was here, with me. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the air. My flashlight flickered, plunging the loft into darkness before returning with a weak, erratic glow. Behind me, a pew scraped against the floor. I froze. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. There was no one there, but the pew had shifted, its legs leaving long, jagged marks in the dust. I backed away, clutching the strange sheet music as if it could protect me. When I descended the stairs, the choir stared at me with wide eyes. "What happened up there?" Elise asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. The next day, I couldn't get the events of the rehearsal out of my mind. The sheet music I'd found was tucked away in my bag, but I couldn't bring myself to show it to anyone. Something about it felt wrong. Instead, I spent the afternoon researching the phrase, Cantus Mortis. It translated to Song of Death. I found scattered references to an old legend about a cursed hymn, said to summon spirits of the restless dead when sung. Supposedly, the hymn was banned centuries ago and thought to have been destroyed. But there it was, lying in the loft of St. Mary's. That evening, I returned to the church alone. I told myself it was to prepare for the Christmas Eve service, but deep down I needed answers. The sanctuary was eerily silent, the stained glass casting distorted patterns on the stone walls as the sun set. I placed the sheet music on the piano and stared at it, debating whether to play it. As if compelled by something unseen, my fingers pressed the keys, following the notes. The melody was haunting, dissonant, yet strangely beautiful. The air around me grew cold, and the faint scent of incense filled the room. I stopped abruptly, my hands shaking. Then, I heard it. Footsteps echoed through the church, heavy and deliberate. They weren't coming from the entrance. They were descending from the choir loft. I spun around, but the sanctuary was empty. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. A shadow stretched across the stone floor, moving toward me, though nothing cast it. The church bells tolled suddenly, their deafening chime shaking the walls. The shadow stopped, lingering at the edge of the piano's light. And then it spoke. "Why did you call us?" I ran from the church that night, leaving the sheet music behind. But the haunting didn't stop. During our final rehearsal before Christmas Eve, the entire choir heard the same guttural hum I'd experienced in the loft. The candles lining the altar flickered violently, their flames bending toward the sheet music now placed on the piano. "Michael, what is that?" Elise asked, pointing to the music. Her voice was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, the hum grew louder. The shadows in the sanctuary deepened, pooling like liquid across the floor. One by one, the choir members stopped singing, their voices replaced by whispers that weren't their own. The whispers merged into a single, unearthly voice, reciting the Latin lyrics of Cantus Mortis. Panic erupted. Some choir members fled, while others froze, unable to move. I grabbed the sheet music and threw it into the fire burning in the altar brazier. The flames roared unnaturally high, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The whispers stopped, but the sense of dread lingered. We canceled the Christmas Eve service. To this day, I'm not sure what we encountered in that church, but I know one thing. I'll never sing Silent Night without hearing that cursed hum in the back of my mind. Sometimes the worst horrors aren't found in haunted houses or dark forests. They're found in the faces of people who don't belong. On Christmas night in 2019, a stranger knocked on my door. What followed still gives me nightmares. Christmas that year had been quiet. My husband, David, and I were staying at my late grandmother's house in rural Vermont, a creaky old farmhouse surrounded by endless fields of snow. It had been years since anyone lived there, but we thought it would be the perfect escape from the chaos of the city. The house felt different in winter, though. The cheerful creaks of the floorboards turned into ominous groans in the stillness. The fireplace's warmth never quite reached the corners of the rooms, leaving shadows to linger. That night, the snowstorm was relentless, howling against the windows and piling in drifts up to the porch. We had just finished dinner and were settling in to watch a Christmas movie when we heard it, a knock at the door. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. David and I exchanged uneasy glances. Who would be out in this storm? He grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door while I followed close behind. As he opened it, the icy wind rushed in, biting at our skin. Standing on the porch was a man, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes tattered and dusted with snow. He didn't look up immediately but stood there, shivering violently. "Please," he rasped. "I need help." David hesitated. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but the man's pitiful state tugged at my heart. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. The man shuffled inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. The air around him felt colder than the storm outside. He didn't smile, didn't thank us, just stood there, staring at the fireplace as if hypnotized. "Are you hurt?" David asked. "Lost?" The man didn't answer. He finally looked up, and his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. They were empty, like he wasn't really there. We offered him a seat near the fire and wrapped him in a blanket. David brought him a mug of hot cocoa, but the man barely touched it. He just sat there, staring into the flames, his hands trembling. "What's your name?" I asked gently. He turned his head slightly, as if hearing me for the first time. "Joseph," he said, his voice hollow. "Where are you coming from?" David asked. Joseph didn't answer. He only muttered something under his breath, words too soft to make out. When I leaned closer, I caught fragments. "They're coming, shadows in the snow, can't escape." A chill ran through me. David noticed my unease and tried to change the subject. "You're safe here," he said. "The storm will pass by morning, and we can call for help." Joseph's head snapped up at that. "Morning," he repeated, his voice rising. "No, they'll be here before then." "Who?" I asked, my heart racing. "Who's coming?" Joseph didn't answer. Instead, he stood abruptly and walked to the window, pressing his face against the frosted glass. "You let me in," he whispered. "They'll know." David and I exchanged nervous glances. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, as if the fire was losing its warmth. The wind outside grew louder, carrying with it faint, unearthly sounds, a low, mournful wail that didn't belong to the storm. By midnight, the storm had worsened. The wind howled like a living thing, and the strange wailing sounds grew louder, more distinct. I peeked through the curtains, but the snow was falling so thickly that I couldn't see beyond the porch. Joseph paced the room now, muttering incoherently. David tried to calm him, but it was no use. "They're here," Joseph said suddenly, his voice sharp and clear. "They'll take us all?" Before we could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The only light came from the fire, its glow weak and uncertain. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it around the room, but Joseph was no longer there. "Joseph?" David called, his voice trembling. A loud thud came from the front door, followed by the sound of scraping, like nails on wood. My breath caught as I pointed the flashlight at the door. Shadows moved across it, their shapes distorted and unnatural. Then came the knocking, heavy and deliberate. David grabbed a poker from the fireplace and motioned for me to stay back. "Who's there?" he shouted. The knocking stopped, replaced by a voice, low, raspy, and inhuman. "Let us in." We didn't open the door. We huddled together in the corner of the room, listening to the voices and the relentless scratching. At some point, it stopped, but we didn't dare move. The house was silent, except for the crackling of the dying fire. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. Light filtered through the windows, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. The snow outside was trampled with footprints, too many to count. They circled the house, leading to every door and window. In the middle of the yard, the snow was disturbed, as if something large had been dragged away. Joseph was gone. We searched the house, but there was no sign of him. Only his wet footprints remained, fading as they led to the front door. We left that house later that day, never to return. To this day, I don't know who Joseph was or what came for him. But every Christmas, when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, I hear the voices again, faint but unmistakable, whispering, "Let us in,